Well, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us for today's webinar, Benchmarks, What Does Good Really Look Like? I'm Doug. I'm the President and CEO of Advisor Solutions. We're a data analytics software and services company. We do a ton of work in fundraising analytics. We have a couple hundred clients, and we've done a bunch of industry surveys and research. So the material I'm going to talk through is coming from that, and I would be glad to follow up afterwards if there's more detailed questions. Also, this session is being recorded, and we'll have it posted and out within a week. And if you have questions, there's a question panel at the lower right of the GoToWebinar screen. You can just put the questions in there, and we'll catch them in order at the end of the session. This will last 30, 40 minutes, and we'll have time for Q&A. So let's get started. The premise for this is just in our work, we're hearing more and more talk about benchmarks, which is good as long as they really are good. In our research, we've learned that less than 17% of the benchmarks that are in use actually produce improved performance, which is obviously the goal. You're trying to measure things, align them against good and less good behavior, understand what good is, and do more of it. And some of the benchmarks actually cause a decline in performance because they drive the team to focus on the wrong things, which clearly isn't good. We're all about benchmarks, but if they aren't the right ones, if they don't help the team focus on moving prospects forward, then they can be a huge distraction or waste of time that can actually draw the well-intentioned team off course. So I'm going to start by just going through 5 kind of premises for what matters in benchmarks. And my first question is, are they strategic or just fun facts? So a couple of versions of this. There's a lot of metrics in use that are really activities or outcomes and not performance drivers. A good benchmark is something that drives performance. And if you understand, what a good level is, your whole operation will improve. An example of an activity would be a field officer visits. An outcome would be revenue achieved, which, by the way, happen to be the 2 primary, far and away measures in major giving metrics in the U.S. in fundraising. That's very different than a performance driver, which would be, am I moving my prospects out of qualification in an appropriate time period? Am I getting them through cultivation towards solicitation in an appropriate time period? Am I closing an appropriate number of my asks? Those are performance drivers. And if those things are in good shape, you'll get the outcomes. And there's obviously activities are pretty easy to measure, which is maybe why there's a lot of that, but they're less fundamental and strategic than performance drivers. The other one is measuring against a fiscal year, which I understand, we're all working on revenue and we all have quarters and fiscal year revenue performance. But that's very different than a consistent time period that's not cyclical and long enough for stuff to bake. So the issue here is you measure visits, which for backup, that's an activity. In the fiscal year, you're 5 months in. What is that telling you? A consistent time period would be a year. But then prospects typically take 2, 3, 4 years on average to move from qualification to a closed solicitation. So you've got a time period that's shorter than how long it takes to cultivate a prospect. And it varies. It's not a consistent period. It's 1 month, 2 months now. It's 6 months in December. It's a year at the end of the fiscal year. Then it clips back. So that's when you look at metrics and benchmarks, kind of want consistency, and you want to make sure you're looking at something that's driving performance. The next one, we hear a lot of talk, about cross-organizational comparison to peers. You get a survey, visits fiscal year to date, is this versus that. Our question would be, do you compare within your organization as well, or primarily just cross-organizational to your peers? Because what we find is the learnings come when you have a group of performers, and some are doing better, and some are struggling in some areas. And if you can share the best practices and the stories, those stories connect and they bring up the efforts or the people that aren't doing as well. We'll see an example in a minute about a group of major giving field officers trying to penetrate pools of accounts. Some are doing better, some are doing less well. But the internal stories in something like that are usually highly more useful than looking across at other groups that are inherently doing things differently or just have different characteristics behind them. Similarly, in annual giving, one of the key measures is the yield of the appeals you're sending. And within your organization, if you send a set of appeals to a group of people, some are going to do better, some less good. That's because they have different messages. Maybe they're in different media. But that's how you can get the learnings, because you're trying to connect messaging and themes with specific groups of people. And it's the A/B comparison internally to time and again we find is more valuable than the cost cross-industry comparison, which is typically how we see benchmarks positioned. The third point, are you looking at the top quartile or just averages? And we see a lot of comparison against averages, and that's probably not what you want. You want to challenge people to move to the top quartile. And in any distribution, there'll be a group at the top, a group in the middle, a group at the bottom. And if you can use the group at the top to highlight best practices and examples and stories to bring up the rest of the team, you got to win. And so we see these, activities on a fiscal year compared cross-organizational averages. I'm not sure those are the best benchmarks, and we'll go a little bit deeper in a few minutes. But these are the three things I think really to pay attention to. Are they really performance drivers over a consistent period? Are you using them within your organization to highlight practices and draw out those successes? And are you trying to stretch people to top quartile, not just average behavior? The next, a little more tactical, are the benchmarks consistently measurable? And can you get enough detail? It's fine to say, hey, my average pool penetration of my team is 60%, but you need to get it down to the field officer level and say, hey, I've got a group doing 80 to 90%. What are they doing? I wonder what's different about them than the group that's operating at 30 to 40%. And then you actually want to get down to the group at 40%. Who are the people they're not visiting with, and what makes them different than the ones they are? What's up with that? And it's that ability to go from the top level and then get down into detail, because the detail is where the actions are. The same with appeals. It's not enough to say our average return on an appeal is 3.2%. It's that I've got some that are over 5, some that are under 1. What makes them different, and which ones with which specific donors with which characteristics? So once you get the top 3 as a part of a strategy, you then need to make sure that you have the ability to consistently measure things and be able to drill into the detail, because that's where the action is. And then using them. We'll have a great example at the end of this. What's the best way to use these benchmarks to draw out stories and best practices and the discussions and insight that can drive improvement? Because if they're just a dashboard and nobody uses them, they're not going to do any good. We see cases where you get, kind of these fun facts that push out to the field officers, the annual giving gets them, and people don't know what to do with them, and they're not helping improve performance. If they're used in a meeting, we have a concept of a war room where people are sitting around like a group of people, and people are asking, I wonder questions, and you're drawing out the stories, and the top quartile performers can share, hey, I did this and it worked great. Everybody hears it. By the way, the top performers on one benchmark may not be on another, so they're going to learn as well. It's a beautiful thing. And then the team starts going to each other to share and to learn. That's when it really starts working, when it comes down off the computer into team rooms and meetings and these stories, and sort of the culture just comes out in these things. So 5 key points here. I'm going to go through some examples. I'm going to come back to give you actually some numbers in both major and then also annual giving, and close with kind of some of the more stuff on the culture and how to use them. So an example, visits fiscal year to date. We see this all the time. It's the most, I think next to revenue, the second most common and widely used metric in major giving fundraising. And it's, fiscal year to date, how many visits have been made? And let's say we're 5 months into the fiscal year here. And it looks like, Tracy Roberts got 48. John Brown's doing awesome. He's got 37. Daniel's got 31. Further way down the list, poor Amanda's only got 15. So, she's not doing so well on this metric. But this is one of these things. It's like we're measuring visits, but what we really want to see, I think the angle in this is, are we connecting with our prospects? And a visit is part of that, but it's not the whole story. And the fiscal year date's a funny period because we're 5 months in. So let's look at it another way. This is a chart on prospect pool penetration. Let me explain it. The rows here are field officers. So this is Heather Ashford. And the coloring is, the blue is the portion of her pool, looks like about 10%, have an active solicitation and have been visited in the last 12 months. this big blue stretch here is they have an active solicitation but haven't been visited. That's a question. How is she doing this? She's got an awful lot of solicitations, the blue is telling you, and they haven't been visited. These people have been visited with no solicitation. The orange have been contacted with a meaningful email or phone dialogue. So she's reaching like 95% of her pool. The line here is 80%. And the thickness is how many prospects are in her pool. So she's doing pretty good on the penetration measure. I'd have some questions if I'm in a review about, like, how are you doing this? What are all these active solicitations that haven't been visited? But there's a group at the top, as there almost always is, that are clearing the line. Amanda, Michael, Tracy, Gretchen, and Heather are all over 80%. By the way, the gray here, the gray is a signed pool that hasn't been connected with in any way in a year. So they are not being developed. So that's a concern. It's assigned prospects that aren't going in. We have a lot of clients, what's up? We got to get rid of the gray. And you go down the distribution. There's some here that are reaching half. There's some down here that are reaching 20, 25%. So some very different performances. You can also just spot on the colors. Some of them, like Justina, has actually like a big chunk of her pool. It looks like 20% have an active solicitation and have been visited. She's kind of leading the pack there. Her solicitations are running maybe 30% of the pool when you have the two blues. She's got a bunch of visits. Looks like she's doing pretty well on solicitations and visits. She's not doing so well with this orange color, which is just connecting with email and phone to the rest of her pool, because she's under the 80% target, but that's a different situation than some of the others. Maybe she's not putting the data in the system and needs to, hey, Justina, you got to get the data in the system. But this one chart has a lot of different stories in it. If I'm using it in a team meeting, I can start drawing out. Now let's compare the two. So here's John Brown on the left. He's doing great on visits. He's doing middle of the road on pool penetration. Looks like he's about 60%. And it looks like, the visit part of it's lower. He's actually, so that's his story. What about Daniel? Well, Daniel's kind of down at the bottom. And by the way, he's got a lot of visits with no other contacts and no active solicitations. So different story with him. So I'm wondering, he's getting all these visits in, but nothing else seems to be happening. Hey, he's got a visit target. He's clearly nailing that. But like the job is to get people into solicitation, and contact them by email and phone as well. So his status in the color keeps something in there. Amanda's actually doing pretty good. She hasn't had a lot of visits in the fiscal year to date. But look at this. She's got a lot of people in solicitation. Maybe this blue's a little high. How are they being solicited but haven't been visited? I'd like to talk about that. But in general, she's doing pretty good. So you get a very different story looking at the data with this activity-based part year versus a more holistic approach towards, I have 100 prospects, how am I cultivating them? Now, why the differences? You got variable time periods. We talked about this, but the fiscal year to date is 5 months right now. The prospects feel, a year? Probably. So if you haven't connected with somebody in a year, they're not going to be feeling a connection. If you've got connections within a year, that's better. Got two time periods here, and one's a partial period, and it varies all the time. The one on the right is a stable period. It's a measure of prospect development. Unique versus total visits. We've seen this. 40 visits can be 8 lunches with 5 friends. 8 times 5 is 40. Or 40 different prospects, totally different. So I bet that my buddy Daniel here is probably jamming up the visits by doing a lot of lunches with his buddies. Is that actually what you want him to be doing? He's not getting solicitations out. He's not, presumably if you looked at his stage balance, it's going to be pretty early on. Then you've got, are we just measuring the field officer or the whole team? Because we've seen, perhaps Amanda down at Amanda may be making less visits, but maybe she's leveraging, the deans, the professors, the healthcare provider leads, and she's leveraging the team to make connection with the prospects, because at the end of the day, Amanda owns this group of prospects. If she's clearing the line by leveraging a larger team, amen to Amanda, that's great. It's a lot better than jamming in the lunches to hit a metric. So we look at this penetration as an important for not just the field officer's visits, but you own the prospect. How are you leveraging the rest of the team? Last, it's not just visits, the active solicitations, email, phone. There's a lot of great connection, which is what you actually want, that can happen through other mechanisms, and it doesn't just have to be visits. And the visits should be used effectively. And typically, we like to see, this total penetration. You'll see later on at 80% is top quartile. You see it here, typical distribution. Visits, if you took off the orange color, should be 50% visits, and active solicitations is pretty typical for the top quartile. So let's dive in on, just want to dive in on one of these for a second and show how you might use this in a meeting. I'm bringing up it live. My app's loading up here. So I'm unpacking a live data set into memory, and we're going to then go through John Brown and look at his pool. And this is the kind of thing, again, you'd want to do this in a meeting and try to help the team just work together on it. Let me hide this panel over here. The same thing, except that the coloring here is the gray is now the red. But let me find John. John is right here. So John, if I click on John, and let's intersect with his no proposals, no contacts. So John is, he's got 65 people in his pool, 34% of it, that have had no proposal, no contact, no visit, no email, no phone in the last 12 months. But also he's got 190 prospects. So right away, John might say, hey, my pool's too big, and I would agree, it ought to be cut back. But like at this point, let's explore who those 65 are, because we want to get some handle on, like, John, who are these people? Why haven't you been visited? And so I'm going to just switch over to a prospect list page. We're loading it up. And get a list of who these 65 people actually are. Nathaniel Williams, huge expected amount. So this is a calculation off a 50 million capacity and a strong affinity, but he hasn't given anything yet. A friend lives in St. John. Then we got Linda Sink, 6 million, 10 to 50 million rating, strong affinity. She's given 380,000. Parent of 107, Lake Forest, Illinois. I wonder, let's just click on her for a minute. What's her giving history been? Click over to the next page. Hey, John, I'm wondering why you haven't had any connection with Linda. She actually looks like a strong prospect, and she's been giving at sort of 10,000 a year. Looks like 2011 it jumped to like 30,000 a year, pretty consistent. Average gift size has gone up. What's been the contact history with her? So this is across time. It looks like 2010. With some visits, attended a Family Fellows, a lunch with President West at the Chicago Club. Met the family on campus. 2007, so this is a few years later, so it must have been back for some reunion. So a bunch of stuff was happening. And by the way, I remember in 11 on the gift chart, wait, isn't that when the giving jumped? Yeah, it looks like when we started connecting with her, she jumped from 10,000 to 30,000 a year. And then there's been no contact for the last, looks like 2 years. I go, John, what's up with this? So that's the way, you can take, I'm going to stop because this is all fake data, but how you can take these things and you spot patterns and you can drill down to the detail with John. You could go through those prospects he hasn't been able to reach. We're going to drop his pool down, but like Linda, we clearly want to keep. And John, you got to go meet with her. She looks like you got to get to her. That's your job. So that's an example of when you create a benchmark around something that's strategic, and you can use it like that to get the stories out. It really, really helps. Come back to this in a minute. We're going to get into actually some numbers. But we've done on our surveys, and over on the left, these surveys are available. We did one on key metrics and major giving about a year ago. We did one a couple weeks ago on annual giving. When we look at what people are measuring, it's almost all outcomes and activities and not drivers. And major giving, dollars raised in the fiscal year, obviously that's that outcome. It's the key. 95% measure that, no surprise. Visits in the fiscal year, 60%. Asks in the fiscal year. These are all activities that are going out. It's not prospect movement through a pipeline. It's not, am I asking them at the right level? It's not, is my pool being penetrated effectively? We saw that these can differ. And then if I look at annual giving, revenue is comparable, 91%. Donor retention rate, that's a little more strategic. Participation rate, numbers of donors, these are kind of mostly outcomes. And if you ask people, which we did, are these actually helping? 30% of the major giving said sadly no, too early to tell. only less than 1 in 6 said these metrics and focusing on them has actually helped me improve performance. On the annual giving side, it's a little bit better. 38% unclear. Less than a third said this is helping me. So, I mean, more evidence that if you get the wrong metrics and are shooting towards targets, like in that visit example, you may actually drive the wrong behavior, not move the prospects forward. So what do we recommend? First, major giving, then annual giving. There's 5 things we'd like to look at in major giving as strategic metrics. We'll come to benchmarks in a second on each of these. First is, are all of our highest capacity and most engaged prospects staffed, and are the pools reasonably sized? So in the John Brown example, a pool of 190s is big. It's bigger than certainly the benchmark would be, and we see most major gift offers able to cover. So that needs some pruning. And we looked at it. One of his people, Linda, he wasn't reaching. Should actually should stay in the pool. Some others probably need to go, and some shuffling needs to be done. Then the second is so you get the right size pool. Then is our pool of assigned prospects being connected with in a reasonable period? That's pretty fundamental. It's not, visits is a part of it, but it's not the whole story as we just saw. Then there's kind of 3 more strategic revenue generating ones. Are we moving prospects forward at a reasonable pace? And we'll give you some data on stages and time in stages, because that's pretty easy to measure. And if you see, groups of prospects in cultivation for 6 years, qualification for 2 years, something's probably off. If they're moving through well, that's great. And some are measuring this, but solicitation levels is the next one. Are the asks that we're making at the right level relative to the capacity and attachment of the prospects? And very few measure this. And it's fundamental because I'll come back to this in a minute, because it's tied into movement and yield. Yield is, are we closing solicitations at an aggressive level? So these balance, because if I'm measured on yield, I close 80% of what I ask. In movement, how fast I get them to stages. And I've got a bunch of $1 million highly engaged prospects who take $1 million highly engaged, multiplying by 0.3 or something. That's $300,000 I should be getting. And I'm asking them 20. I'm going to get them closed. I'm going to nail yield and movement, but I'm leaving a lot of money on the table. On the other hand, if I have $1 million prospects who are not engaged at all, $1 million times like 0.02 or something, $20,000 might be a good ask amount for them. And if I ask them 300, my yield rate's going to go down. So these actually all move together. And when you look at them across a team, there's clues that if the solicitation level looks low, but the movement's fast and the yield is high, probably under asking. If they're all in balance along the benchmarks, probably doing really well and you're maximizing revenue. So when we do this work, we're trying to move clients away from activity-based, fiscal year metrics to more strategic that balance out over a 2 to 4 or 5 year cultivation cycle of a typical major giving prospect, which is, you want the revenue in the fiscal year and forecast it, but most of these prospects are taking longer than that to develop. So let's look at some of the benchmarks. This comes from a bunch of research, and we'd be glad to provide more detail and background. And there is a webinar. It'll come up on the last page as well as the pages I just showed you. How many prospects to assign? Typically, the major giving program where the solicitations are, it's either 25 or 50,000 up. I know some of you are 100,000 up, but somewhere in that range, above high-end annual, 80 to 125 active prospects. And we have a whole nother tutorial on this, why that is. But it's because you're trying to move through stages and you're trying to get connection with the group, and the human capacity to go much higher than that and get the interaction you need to get from qualification to early cultivation to solicitation to close is hard. That John Brown example, 190 is certainly on the upper end. And this is benchmark data from a bunch of clients. Then there's penetration, 80% plus. At least 80% of the assigned prospects are contacted in the last 12 months. 50% plus are visited and or actively solicited. So in an active solicitation phase, obviously you could have in-depth phone conversations and other forms of communication. But certainly at the beginning, you're not having that, and the visits matter because you got to get the personal connection and get the cases established. This is not average. This is top quartile, which is where we would put these benchmarks. Then efficient movement through stages. Bunch of research on this in the Key Metrics and Major Giving webinar. Typically less than 6 months in qualification. The goal here is to get a meeting and see if this prospect has the potential to make a major gift. Yes or no. So there's a lot more movement in here, in and out. And that's, by the way, why the penetration will never be 100%, because you got part of the qualification pool you're not going to get a meeting with. They're going to fall out. So you could push this maybe a little higher, but not a lot higher. Anyway, so you're in qualification. Then we usually see 2 stages of cultivation, early and mature. And it's 8 to 12 months in each one of those. We like breaking into the 2 stages, but it's typically 18 to 24 months through this. A lot of data behind this. And then solicitation, which is once an active proposal's out, how long to close it. Usually it's less than a year. Depends on the situation, obviously. And principal giving, which we would say is like $5 million and up, is a little more slow than this, and it's probably doesn't lend itself to benchmarks quite as readily as the major giving levels. So next, 25 active proposals at any one time. And what we're seeing is out of that, a typical good ratio is the top quartile ratio is 20 to 30% of the asks are closed, which ends up in 8 to 10 solicitations in the last 12 months. So we're not on fiscal year here. We're on a moving calendar 12-month period. And if you look at movement through stages, if you have 125 active prospects with these kinds of timing, you're going to have roughly 25 in solicitation with active proposals. It's what the math does between this and this. And then if you're closing, 20 to 30% of the asks, you're getting 8 to 10 solicitations in a 12-month period, which it's a fiscal year. But we like measuring across that so you kind of see what's coming. And not everybody closes in June, so December picks all that up, the cyclicality. Now this next one, the one in the middle, is are we asking at the right level? It's a little more complicated, but we sum the ask amounts and the solicitations and divide by the current year expected amount for the pool. And the current year expected amount is calculated out of capacity times attachment or liquidity, attachment divided by liquidity minus recent giving. So if I'm a $1 million capacity, I'm highly engaged. That might be $300,000 in my pool. I might divide that over for 7 years, because not everybody makes the gift next year. They're going to make it at some point over the next years to capture a calculated expected value, which when we look at a pool, you start seeing imbalances. There's a whole webinar on this one, but this is really important and it's not measured very often. Now at the bottom, we did put the visits up here, 75 to 120 in-person visits in a last 12 months is a achievable metric that's pretty normative. And we put last 12 months versus fiscal year because the fiscal year, again, because of it's not a consistent time period, can get flaky. A lot more on this in the other webinar, but these are the kind of benchmarks that if we feel that if people shoot towards, they will achieve great results. In annual giving, we just did a webinar on this a couple of weeks ago, so I was going to ask you to look there for more detail. But the same idea. It's not, revenue in numbers of donors. That is the top line. You want to see, am I growing the donor base? Once I acquire a donor, how good of a job am I doing at keeping him or her? When they lapse, do I a good job of getting them back? And we've got examples of where, we're lapsing donors and not getting them back and not spending the energy on it. That's a flag. It's expensive to acquire a donor, and once you lose them, in 2 to 3 years, they look like non-donors again, and they're expensive to reacquire. So you starting back at the beginning of the cycle. How am I determining who to appeal to in the first place? What characteristics? Demographic, psychographic engagement. Am I segmenting my non-donor population, focusing the messaging appropriately? Am I measuring my appeal yields? Is my messaging connecting? Which messages with which segments, with which subsegments? Am I using the right media for what time of year? Am I soliciting with the right frequency? Am I getting my higher touch appeals from the right people? And then are my donors giving more over time at the right amount? Similar to major giving, we want to make sure, if you've got somebody in a wealthy zip code from the classes of the 70s and 80s, you're not asking them for a $50 gift. Ask them for $1,000 or a couple $1,000 gift. Differentiate it. Do people in wealthy zips and all that? So there's a set of things here that are much more strategic in the performance drivers versus just the outcomes. And again, there was another webinar on this 2 weeks ago, but participation. The goal is to increase the donors each year. This is kind of an outcome. It's really a higher ed focus because, healthcare and non-membership nonprofits don't have this pool that they're trying to measure as a ratio against. And the data we have looked at consistently, the percentage participation varies widely, and it's really based on the maturity of the program. Some of the private schools with long-running programs with a loyal alumni base are up over 50. Some of the state programs that are newer are down at 5. So we kind of liked a little bit that, but we really prefer some of these others. Donor stability benchmark is what's my ratio of lapsed donors to current donors? In here we're looking at the lapse in the last 5 years to the current. So I have 100 current donors and I have 90 lapsed donors. That would be a ratio of 90%. That's good, and less than that's better. But we see this data ranges up to 280%. That means I have 100 current donors. I've got 280 lapsed donors over the last 5 years. I mean, that's not good. And that's a combination of, am I retaining my current donors? 70% is good. The data ranges widely. This is a kind of an elite private school with a well-running program, strong retention. This is shouldn't be there. This should be up more like 50, 55%. And then what's my reacquisition rates over the 5-year lapses? So if I have 100 donors and I'm retaining 70, I'm losing 30 over 5 years. 5 times 30 is 150. If I'm reacquiring 15% a year, I'm getting basically 20, 25 back, and I acquire in some more non-donors, I'm growing. But if these ratios start falling off, I'm going to have problems here, and it's going to have trouble keeping my donor base up. Non-donor acquisition. The goal is to segment. There's less metrics on this. It's more of a concept. We talked about this in the other webinar. Appeal yields. There are a range here. For current donors, we've studied quite extensively the percentage yield on an appeal, which is the number of gifts divided by how many appeals were sent. For retaining current donors, 5% plus is good, top quartile, 2% plus for reacquiring lapsed donors, and 0.7% for non-donors. And what you do with this is you're going to have a range. If you look at the current donor retention, some appeals are going to be 5, 6, 7%. Some are going to be 0.2, 0.3, 0.4%. What's different about them? What's different with the interests that you're expressing, the media, the messaging, the touch? Are they high touch or low touch? Are they coming from personalized letters from classmates, or are they just a general blast from the organization? This data at this level lets you unpack what worked and what didn't, and lets you tune the program and focus on what worked. It's sort of like the same thing with the major giving. Let's get the stories out about what's working really well and do more of that, and defocus on the things that aren't doing as well. And these are the kinds of metrics and benchmarks, and these are benchmarks from a lot of data that can help you tune an organization. Touch points, which is how many touches am I giving to people in a year. 6 to 12 is the benchmark in a 12-month period, and this is consistent with business to consumer marketing in the private sector. On our data, we saw 4, and there's a huge range. 1 means you're not getting enough energy. You have a budget, and if you send it to everybody and everybody gets 1, that's not an effective use of the budget. If you blast everybody with emails 42, that's really bad too, because you drive them away. If you get in this right balance, you're going to get the frequency of the messaging to convert. And you've got to look at this whole, if you're at this level, this whole approach of segmenting the population down, so you don't send everything to everybody, but you're bringing the touches up into a range and then focusing on the appeals that work. All of a sudden, you're going to start getting these ratios up, and you're going to grow the donors and the revenue. So these things start working together. The average gift size trend, again, we like targeting based on capacity or proxies for capacity, like wealthy zip codes, degree, there's a lot of things you can figure out here to get some sense. Is this a $50 donor or is this a $1,000 ask? And what you want to see is more increasing than decreasing. And there's a huge range. Less than 1% are increasing to 40%, with a median of 20%. We really don't have a consistent benchmark for this. We have a lot of observations. We need to do some more work in this area. But these are the kinds of things that are measurable. They let you drill down into detail. They let you get stories out, and they let you adjust based on what's working and what's not working quite as well. So the fifth point on the starting slide was creating this culture of analytics and using them. And in both the major giving and annual giving area, when this has worked well, it's when senior management believes it will have benefits, and they actually drive discussion around it. They push it out to the team. They create a war room. They get people together, and they ask the right questions based on what you see. I wonder questions. This is beautiful. I wonder why I have 5 appeals that are yielding over 5%, and I've got another 15 that are under 1%. What's different about them? Why are we doing the ones that are under 1%? Can we do more of the ones over 5%? I'm wondering why, my star, John, he's closing at a 30% rate. He's got his typical ask is in line with the calculated expected value, so he's getting good solicitation levels, and he's moving through stages really quickly. He's got, in cultivation under 2 years and so forth. John, what are you doing? How are you accomplishing this? Somebody else may be doing better at, getting early prospect penetration. You might actually learn that some people have skills in different areas, realign the team, but those stories that start coming out reshape what's going on, and that to us is the value of this. And we see, we're a data analytics company. We sell, dashboards and data stuff. But I want to just iterate how important this slide is, and realize that as you start doing this, there's also resistance to change, and some people aren't going to like it. Especially in annual giving, we've seen it where there's people whose jobs are to send the holiday card to everybody, and you're going to say, no, we're not going to send it to everybody. We're going to send it to a subset that look like this, and we're going to use the remaining money to send another piece in like February as a reminder to some of them and so forth. That can draw fear, resistance, bucking. In major giving, field officers don't like data and metrics typically. Some do, but most don't. We've got data on that too. They've got relational skills. They've got other skills. So you start having these questions, it can start causing resistance. But the last point is highlight and promote results. And play around and try and experiment, especially in annual giving. We've had cases where don't stop the whole holiday mail appeal, but try part of it differently, see what happens, and then adjust. And the same with major giving. Get a few people on board with this. Actually help me close more $1 million donors. It's great for everybody. Like, look at what happened here. So you can do some skunks works, some pilots, and then kind of build from the successes. So we just covered quite a bit. But just back to kind of what matters is benchmarks that are strategic, not just fun facts, because they're performance drivers, they're a consistent time period that actually is in line with how long it takes to cultivate a prospect. The idea of comparing within your organization and highlighting the stories so you can have those discussions. We did that with the team where we looked at visits, which was activities fiscal year. We shifted to penetration over a 12-month period, and we started looking at different team members who were clearly doing some things differently. What's up? How are we doing that? Top quartile versus averages, consistently measurable and detailed. Can you drill down on them? And then using them to draw out stories and best practices in the discussions that drive insight for improvement. So as we close and go to questions, getting these things right is really critical because you look at the data, it's showing most fundraisers are measuring activities and outcomes over a fiscal year, and they're not getting results from it. They're chewing up a bunch of time, a bunch of system time, a bunch of IT time, a bunch of team time. And when you look at, when they self-report, is this working? The answer is, less than 1 in 3 for major giving, and less than 1 in 6 for major giving, and less than 1 in 3 for annual giving. Why? Well, I would postulate that because it's these kinds of things. And if you get this right, how cool would it be if across, our not-for-profit fundraising sector, those ratios improved and people said, yeah, 5 out of 6 are saying this helped us raise more money because we learned the best practices, we learned the success stories, we're able to repeat them and build a much more effective organization. That's sort of our point behind this, is to get data out there that will help the industry kind of see a way to use this in a much more strategic and informed way. So, time for some questions. There's several questions on stage movement timing. One says that another well-known vendor or consultant, I wonder who, consistently says that 18 months should be the expectation for moving a constituent from identification to solicitation. You've suggested a longer time span. What does the data support? Obviously, there's ranges on these things, but if you think about it, if you're trying to raise, say, your averages, I've got them up on my whiteboard here, like $140,000 major gift is probably pretty from the median across our clients, and you're starting with new assignments, and you just run through those stages. It pretty much is, 6 months to qualification. You've got to get some dialogue going about a purpose. That's usually a year, might be a year and a half, 2 years, because you've got 2 stages of that. And then you've got to get a solicitation out and work it to get it closed. It's hard to see how that's 18 months for that size gift, and the data doesn't show it. There are cases. I mean, this is, you can plot this on a bell curve, one of those histogram things, and there's a median in the middle that's kind of a little bit longer than this. This is better performance than the median. And there's clearly outliers that are going to be much faster, and some are going to be a lot longer. There's stories about 6-8 year to close one of those gifts. That's part of the game. There's others that, I assume that there are some 18 months ones. There's probably some 12 months ones. But if you have a question on that, there's an entire webinar up on our. It's on this page, advisorsolutions.com, resources tutorials. Another one, how many prospects to assign to a major gift officer, which sort of takes it back up from the bottom of typical close levels. That means you need this many in solicitation, which means you need this many in mature cultivation. So it backs it up, and it is building off data for time through each of those stages is probably the best piece we have on that. On which advisor dashboard can I find major give metrics penetration? So there's these key metrics in major giving takes those 5 metrics that I shared with benchmark data, and then goes through. We actually did a bunch of research for the Drive conference a year ago. It goes through data from that on what people are doing with a bunch of detail, and then it goes into kind of our view on what performance should be across those things. It does a lot more on how to calculate expected values and all of that for looking at the ask levels. So that's key metrics in major giving. We did one last week on key metrics in annual giving, which builds off those last 2 slides in annual giving. Creating a culture of analytics is a session we did with Wake Forest on how to use this with teams and some of their tips and tricks on actually getting the team to use this kind of stuff. And then how many prospects to assign to a major gift officer is the stage movement detail, all up on this same page. In our annual giving office, we do a lot of comparisons between the last 3 fiscal years. Do you have any thoughts on how helpful that is, both instead of, in addition to moving 12-month benchmarks? Yeah, so that actually sounds, so when we do like strategic assessments in annual giving, we're looking back across fiscal years. I think so yes, that question I would say is fine. And the thing where it really gets off is when you're looking at major giving cultivation within a fiscal year and you're trying to measure the activities, because it's sort of a flaky thing that doesn't time with how long it takes to cultivate them. Annual giving is more of it's obviously an annual thing. So, to to look at last fiscal year, the year before, and this year to date, that all works fine. So I would say it's great. And in our work, we're looking at, appeal yields. Those, if you're looking at, so I'm going to caveat that. I'm rambling a little bit, but appeal yields, we typically want to look at a moving 12-month window because the problem is, like, by October, you're partway into this fiscal year, so you've got a set of appeals that are summer and fall, and you're comparing them to what? You want to go back the whole cycle and look at it, because summer's a harder time than spring, so kind of timing makes a difference, and you're going to just clip off if you're only looking at the full fiscal year. If you went back to, if you're June 30th, looking at the 18th fiscal year, you've got activity that you're doing like summer and fall, you're going to start missing. So we generally like look at the current lapse, all that locked into fiscal years. The appeal yield analysis we typically recommend over a moving 12-month window. There are obviously other ways of doing it. But you need some period that's consistent and not cyclical and measures a reasonable time period. There's another question on more of a technical data question. Let me paraphrase it. Where does the data for these different metrics come from? And there's sort of, I guess, two sides. There's the major giving and there's the annual giving. Almost all of this data is stored in the CRMs. I'm sure 95% of you are running, whether it's Blackbot or Lucien or Agilon or Salesforce, or there's some others out there as well. The trick is getting it into a form and binning it, aggregating it so that it's useful in the way I just went through in that example a few minutes ago. There are different ways of doing that. Some clients put in data warehouses and then put like Power BI and some reporting tools in front of it. We are in memory warehouse, so we're taking all that data and we're running in memory. So that's how we get this ability to spin through the dimensions. So it's a dashboard look at the top, but then the way we get the drill down is we actually have the data in RAM. So, we're not constrained to a warehouse, and we kind of simplify the cost of a warehouse by doing the in-memory side of it. So I don't want to, I think our way is better, but there's a lot of people who put warehouses with kind of Microsoft tools or Tableau tools on top of it to push content out. Just be careful if you actually want to use it for the drill down. A lot of those tools are not good at the sort of the query and drill through on a dimensional basis. And also some of this stuff lends itself to predictive modeling, and there's a variety of ways of doing that. So there's the metrics, there's a variety of tools that could do it, but whoever does the work should be thoughtful about how to create the content and the metrics. And then, the benchmarks, the actual comparison numbers, we're going to put this report out. They're pretty public, and we'll give you the detail behind it if you want it. But then it's each of your jobs to get the data in the form we can use it, and then have the kind of meetings that look like this. And this actually may be the trickiest part to get senior management and the leadership team on board to have these kinds of discussions. But yeah, we help with that. Martin Lundy's, Ben Swaley's, GGA's, some of our other partners help with that. So this is hard to do internally. It's why those of us on the outside can come in and help do it, but it's critical. Good questions. What's next on this question list? How long does it take to get this to work? So I think the key metrics in major giving, which is this one, talks about it usually takes a couple of years to get this kind of a process working. Because here's what happens. Somebody like us comes in and puts the system in, and then everybody looks at it and goes, great. And then they start tweaking the numbers, they get adjusted, and some bucket, and then the data's not in the system. So that kind of takes maybe the first year to get cleaned up, but coming out of the first year, you've got people agreeing at least the data's right, and you've got some people saying this actually helps me. So coming out of the first year, you probably have groups saying this helped me, I did better. Some people are skeptical, and some people still may not like it. But then usually the second year, the team starts rallying around that this actually helps more and more people do better. And then the culture starts shifting. And then just an example, I won't name it, but we put a major giving metrics project with benchmarks in last December at a kind of large well-known school. They're wrestling with it. And we're coming back out there in a few weeks, and we're going to sit down with the team, and we're going to start asking I wonder questions with the team, the major giving leadership team and some of the field officers. And, you know, as outsiders, we can actually drive that discussion. We're not going to get stumped on the data. You know, there can be tough questions come out. And we're also, you know, we're going to not, the key is not to like poke at anybody or make it a negative experience. It should be a positive experience. We're learning from what's working well. And these metrics and thresholds and benchmarks, if they're looked at punitive or they're looked at as a good, bad, they're not, people are going to kind of find ways to bucket. If they're viewed as something that helps us understand what's working, that's how you get the second year, this kind of ramp up in enthusiasm and people really bringing the program up. The annual fund's similar. Finish on major giving. So that's a case where what will come back in like a month. It'll be 9 months after we put the thing in. Some team members are getting it. I think out of that we'll have an upswing. We'll probably come back in the winter and sit down again and have another kind of sort of working session, war room up on the screen, like we did with John Brown in the example. Well, like, hey John, what is up with this? Like you got these prospects they're not getting connected with, and he'll say, hey, pull to the street, the pull down. Yeah, what about Linda? Well, I got to get to Linda. You caught me in that one, and then maybe somebody else will jump in and give some advice. So that's how it starts going. Annual giving. We had one example where you put one of these things in, and the annual giving director, it was a downward spiral. It was like a hockey stick. It was going down. They changed the annual giving director, and the new person came in and started doing much more data-driven stuff. And the results were like a hockey stick coming up. Like there was a complete turnaround. But at the beginning, when she started using this, there was a lot of resistance. You know, there was a holiday giving program that was sent to way too many people, and it had killed the budget, so there was no follow-up. She suggested cutting that way back. It didn't go. So she smartly said, why don't I try an experiment with a different version of that to a subset of people and see what happens? And it totally worked. And she tripled the revenue per capita with a smaller cost. And so then that connected, and then over time the program transitioned, and it was the performance, which is revenue, was dropping, and then it made this abrupt upward turn hockey stick, and it's working really well. But that also probably took, the project was in. She did an experiment, like probably executed 4 to 6 months later. So it was like a year. In a year, the program was really improving. But yeah, it's naive to think these things have instantaneous upward. I'd like to say they do, but they don't, because you've got human issues and behavioral issues behind it that have to come along. I think those are two examples of reality. What size team is needed to support a culture of analytics? I think it actually works with any team. It's kind of the leadership, right? The leadership values data-driven discussions, calling out these stories that are just the strategic performance stories. We see to work with small teams of, what's our smallest team? 5 or 10 total people. To we're at some large universities where there's hundreds of people in fundraising, 17 cohorts, law schools, business schools, arts and sciences, undergrad, theology schools, all this, on both the annual and major giving side. And the ones where this, in both cases, it's the leadership is behind it and sees the value. It's hard if you've got like 2 analysts who are all excited and want to do this stuff, and you can't get the traction with the teams, or you can't actually change the annual giving program and play around and experiment with it, which is why senior leadership comes on board. So I'm I'm looking at my other teammates here now. Does that sound right? Because, I don't think the team size matters as much as the desire of somebody to have this culture of actually looking at the data, not in a threshold, good or bad, but in this storytelling mode. We have the same thing. We do work in other industries, do a lot of work in mid-market manufacturing. This is exactly the same. I think the slide might have come from there. You get the team in a war room, you put the stuff up on the board, you start asking questions, the team can answer them on the spot, without going back and querying the database. Literally in the meeting, you get the answers like, this is good because, this is bad because, this could be better if we did this. It's this in-memory base, the ability to drill through to get to answers in sub-second, in the meeting, speed of thought is huge for having this happen. But it's the same idea. The leader is driving the questions, and he's not penalizing people. He's trying to learn, and obviously if somebody keeps doing something like that's not good over and over again, that's a different story. But here we're trying to learn and then suggest courses for improvement. I think that's probably not the team size, but it's the leadership. And that other one, the ability to use it in the meeting, we call that killing the cycle of pain. Because the problem is, if you can't quickly get the answer off of whatever you've built, and you've got to go back to IT and do database queries, and if you get the data a week later, everybody forgets what they were talking about. It has to be fast. It has to be able to be looked at, clicked on, drilled through. Okay, I get it. Hey, John, you got to go meet with Linda. You get to her. I'll cut your pool back. I'll move 30 or I'll take 60 people off because you're 190, and I will move them over someplace else, and we'll all be better. But that's a quick one. What about leading up? If your senior management isn't data driven, that's a great question. So we have had clients where we've been brought in, prospect research, annual giving, one or the other, advancement services. Sometimes senior leadership may not even be loosely involved, and we've got several great examples of where their results caught the attention of senior leadership and probably shifted the whole culture in the organization, right? Because they did things and really explain, like, it was like this. I saw this. I then tried something different that was this, and it worked. Hey, let's do more of this. So that's a good point. Somebody just made that you can lead up on these kinds of things, as long as you're aware, like, this is the ideal or some version of this. What if you're starting a new program and don't have much data? Good question. This data, when we look at the annual giving, and you're trying to figure out which appeals are working and what's not, if you have a couple of years of appeal sends and gift data, and some characteristics and prospects, that's enough to get started. You don't need, in fact, when we do appeal yield analysis, we probably are only loading in the last 2 years of data, because what you sent 4 years ago, kind of irrelevant. Things change so much. So, you need a couple of years. And I know there's some healthcare providers here. If we're looking at healthcare data, generally the patient side interaction, takes it's like a 6 to 18 month cultivation period. So the median's about a year typically from the last encounter before a gift is made. So you actually need some back data there. If you're just getting the data, it usually takes that period of time to ramp to something. But it's not, 2 years of most of this data is enough to get going. And then the next question is another data question. I've got dirty data. I don't have enough data. I would say to everybody, I bet you have a lot more data than you think you have. And you get started with these things. You find the holes in the data. You clean it up. And you're never going to be perfect with this, because as soon as you're perfect, something's going to change or something's going to go in wrong, and it won't be perfect again. So we're big believers on using what you've got. There's teams like us that can. We're data geeks at our base. We can take the data and we can figure out holes and help you fill them. Like, we've got situations in an annual giving program where there's no wealth of information on 90% of the prospects. Well, guess what? There's public domain information on where people live, and that's actually not bad. And then if you want to really, you can apply class years, and a reasonable person would say somebody who lives in Greenwich, Connecticut from the classes of the 70s or 80s is probably better off than somebody who doesn't. So ask them more money. I mean, it's literally as simple as that. And if you're thoughtful about this, you can start filling in gaps. Will these slides be available? Yes, we've recorded this. The slides in the recording will be up within the week, and we'll let you know. I see we're right at the 1 hour point. Any other questions? If you have other questions, you've got, oops, I went too far. You've got my contact information here. We love talking about this stuff. And there are a rich set of resources that go deeper on the major giving, annual giving, creating a culture of analytics, and I'll add in the how many prospects to assign to a gift officer would be the other related piece to this. And I guess we're at our time limit. Bunch of great questions. Thanks for joining today, and have a good rest of the afternoon.